you believe someone once saved a Bigfoot right in the middle of the jungle? Not capturing it, not running from it, but quietly bandaging its wounds deep in the forest, with no camera, no witnesses, just compassion. In the fall of 1994, Jo Delaney, a 55-year-old woman living alone near Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, stumbled upon a massive, injured creature, worn, proud, and undeniably not human. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she stayed. And what happened next was something no one could have predicted, because the truth is, Bigfoot isn't alone. And helping one might mean stepping into an ancient power struggle you were never meant to see. But Jo, she didn't just witness it, she became part of it. What began as a silent rescue became a secret bond between two worlds. A week later, they came back, 4 of them. And what they left on her doorstep wasn't a warning, it was a gift. A black obsidian blade, polished and sacred. A relic of trust. This story has never been told in full, until now. It's based on Jo's personal notes, cross-checked with unexplained ranger reports from 1994, and a real artifact found in her cabin 7 years later. So before we dive in, I just want to ask you, where are you watching this from right now? And what's your name, friend? Because this story deserves to reach every corner of the world, to every heart that still believes there's mystery left in the wild. If this tale touched something in you, consider leaving a like, subscribing, and joining our growing circle of Bigfoot believers. This isn't just a video. It's the beginning of a community that listens when the forest speaks. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. The forest was supposed to hum at that hour, but it didn't. Late afternoon light filtered through the golden branches of the Wallowa-Whitman. But there was no wind. No crows, no squirrels leaping branch to branch. Not even the restless whir of bugs that normally filled the air like static. The silence was so wide, it made the space between trees feel hollowed out, as if something had pressed pause on the world. Jo Delaney stopped mid-step. One boot scuffed the leaves, and the sound was too loud. Her breath caught halfway. She adjusted the strap on her pack, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the slope ahead. She'd walked this path 100 times, maybe more. It was nothing but a forgotten trap line, curling around the eastern ridge and dropping into a run of willow and rock. But today, it felt wrong. Not dangerous, not yet, just displaced. Like a memory you couldn't trust. She crouched and touched the ground. The soil was dry under the moss, but the moss itself had a darkened line, flattened. Something big had moved through here, not in a straight line, in a curve, skirting the edges of the trail like it knew where not to step. She straightened slowly. Her fingers lingered on the strap of her canvas satchel. Inside, a small tarp, coiled rope, 2 protein bars, and an old .38 revolver she hadn't fired since '82. She didn't bring it for danger. She brought it because she was too old to run. Jo was 55, and these woods had held more of her life than any town ever did. But that didn't mean she trusted them. The only sound now was her breath, hitching slightly. She turned left off the trail, heading through the dense underbrush toward a dry ravine she rarely used. If something was watching the path, it wouldn't expect her to take the harder way. The animal part of her brain, buried under decades of weather and work, knew how to move quieter than most men ever learned. She kept low, stepped light. Then it came. A sound she didn't know she'd been waiting for. A breath. Low, deep, rhythmic. It wasn't a predator's panting. It wasn't injured, gasping, or wild. It was paced. Like someone used to the rhythm of stillness. Like something trying not to be heard, but needing air too badly to disappear completely. She froze behind a thick hemlock, heart beating in her mouth. Through the thinning trees ahead, the light shifted. The last stretch of sunlight had fallen across a grove just down the slope. A clearing of sorts. Unmarked on her map, but not unfamiliar. A place she'd seen before and never bothered naming. That's where she saw it. Leaning against a tree like it belonged there. Massive, dark, hunched. For a moment, her mind snapped to bear. It had the size, the bulk, but the angles weren't right. The way its back curled, the proportion of arm to shoulder, the shape of the head. No bear she'd ever seen had a neck like that, or limbs that long. No bear sat with its knees drawn inward like something human trying to stay awake. Its fur, if you could even call it that, looked worn down in places. Not matted, not tangled, just weathered. As if the years had pressed it into the hide, like time didn't treat it gently. But it was the eyes that held her. They were amber, clouded at the edges, like cataracts. But behind the haze, something flickered. A knowing. Not fear, not challenge. Just the fatigue of being seen. The exhaustion of no longer hiding. She didn't breathe. On the forest floor, just before the thing's massive feet, Joe saw gouges in the soil. Deep, uneven, kicked sideways. Struggle. There was more. Broken limbs, a patch of fur smeared against bark, and a trail of dry blood leading uphill, like someone had dragged themselves down just to rest. But there was no body, no bones. Whatever had happened, this one had survived it, by force of will alone. And now, it looked at her the way a dying soldier might look at the medic who arrived too late. Joe didn't move, not a twitch. Her legs trembled, not from fear, but from the tension of holding still. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called once, then went silent again. She didn't know how long she stood there. Time felt useless. Then something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, coiled and whispering. But something else pushed against it. Something older. A memory, half-rotted and sharp-edged. A night, long ago, when she'd walked away from someone who'd needed her. She couldn't remember their face anymore. Just the moment her boots turned in the wrong direction. This time she didn't turn. Slowly, so slowly, she reached over her shoulder and unhooked the small tarp folded in her pack. Her hands moved on muscle memory. Quiet, precise. She stepped forward into the clearing. One pace, then another. It didn't flinch. She stopped 5 feet from it. Her voice came out hoarse, like it hadn't been used in days. I won't leave you. The thing blinked once, heavy and slow. Joe knelt beside it, spread the tarp across the ground like laying down a pact. And as the wind finally returned, just a whisper through the pine, she prepared to carry the weight of something the world had never dared name. Joe had pulled strangers from wreckage before, tipped over trucks, frozen rivers. Once, years back, a man pinned beneath a snowplow with a broken femur and frostbitten hands. That had been hard, but this was harder. It didn't fight her. That was the strangest part. Not a twitch of resistance, just heavy breathing and the occasional tremor that traveled down its limbs like a silent warning of how far gone it was. It was too large for logic and too silent for any animal she'd ever met. Yet Joe didn't pause to question it now. She was past that moment. She slid the tarp as close to its body as she could and levered one corner under its shoulder with a flat pine branch. When that didn't work, she knelt and used her hands. The fur was damp with sweat and old blood. Up close, it smelled like wet bark and something faintly coppery beneath. She didn't flinch. When she finally got it settled, the old wooden sled she'd left behind the shed for years, God knows why she hadn't burned it, came into use like it had been waiting. The thing groaned under the weight, but didn't splinter. She looped rope through the tarp corners, tied knots without thinking, then hooked the sled line around her waist. The slope wasn't kind. Her boots sank deep with every pull. Leaves slid beneath her heels. Muscles in her back screamed within minutes. But she didn't stop. She didn't look behind her either. She didn't want to see if its eyes were open. That would make it real in a way her body wasn't ready for. She just focused on the rhythm of her steps. Left, right, brace, pull. The forest around her stayed unnaturally quiet. No rustling, no birds, no cracking branches or squirrels scrambling for higher ground. Just her own breath and the hiss of the sled dragging across earth and fallen leaves. It took her the better part of an hour to reach the old supply cabin. Nobody used it now. Not since the Forest Service rerouted patrols 10 years ago. It still stood, though, barely. A one-room box of dark cedar and rusted hinges. She kicked the door open with the toe of her boot, then turned and pulled the sled inside, breath chugging like a diesel engine about to fail. The thing lay still as she spread blankets under it. She pulled a tin basin from the shelf, filled it with water from her canteen, and set it on the small iron stove. The oil lamp sputtered once before catching flame. The glow was soft, not forgiving, just enough to see. She unzipped the med kit and unrolled a band of gauze with fingers that remembered what it meant to patch torn skin. She didn't dare cut clothing away. There was none. Just fur, thick in some places, thinned in others, matted down along the side where the blood was darkest. She soaked a cloth in warm water and pressed it in slow, steady circles until the worst of the dried blood peeled away. There were 2 wounds, one long, torn open along the rib cage, the other lower, near the abdomen. Deep gashes. Not from a blade, not clean enough, not an animal trap either. These were rough, like a branch had been broken inward, or something had struck hard and twisted. She'd seen damage like that on soldiers caught in rock slides or men mauled by machinery. It was brutal, but not fatal if it hadn't pierced anything inside. The bleeding had slowed. That was something. As she cleaned, it stirred. One of its massive arms shifted and pressed slowly, deliberately, against the cabin floor. Not to rise, not to strike, just to brace. The way someone does when they've been in pain so long they know how to hold it steady. Joe froze for a second, then continued wrapping the wound. It didn't make a sound. It didn't pull away. When she leaned left to secure the gauze, it tilted slightly, adjusting just enough to make the angle easier. That stopped her breath cold. That wasn't instinct. That wasn't reflex. That was awareness. Willful cooperation. She sat back on her heels and stared at it. Its chest rose and fell with slow, even effort. The light from the lamp flickered across its face. The features weren't ape-like. No long snout, no drooping jaw or jutting teeth. The brow was heavy, the skin dark under layers of grime and hair. But the nose was flatter than a human's, and the eyes were old. Not wild, not tame, just worn thin from watching too long. She lit another oil lamp, placed it near the foot of the cot, and stepped back. It stayed seated, breathing steady. Joe turned to tend the fire, tossing in another log and striking a match from a box older than the stove itself. Flame caught quick. The dry wood hissed and popped, releasing the scent of pitch and pine. That's when she noticed it. How the creature shifted slightly, just barely, away from the heat. Not from fear, not from pain. From understanding, respect. Like it knew what fire was. Like it knew whose space this was. It didn't cross into the light. She sat down on the bench near the door and rubbed her hands together. Not from cold, but from the kind of tremor that came after adrenaline. She hadn't processed it yet. Not the weight, not the size, not even the fact that she dragged something not quite human through a forest she once thought she knew. Only when she let her eyes fall closed for a moment did it hit. What she'd done. She'd intervened, stepped past the line most people never saw, let alone crossed. She'd chosen not to walk away. A sound broke the stillness. Barely there. A soft thump, not from inside. The outer wall of the cabin creaked, just once, as if something had tapped it. Not knocked, not slammed, tapped, measured, then vanished. She didn't move toward it. She didn't open the door. There was no hurry. Whatever it was had already gone. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an invitation either. It was acknowledgement. She looked back toward the cot. It was watching her. Only its eyes moved. The rest of its body remained stone still. The wound along its side darkened the gauze, but the bleeding had slowed. It didn't flinch under the weight of it. It didn't ask for anything. It just stared, unblinking, as if memorizing her shape. Jo leaned her head back against the wall. The oil lamps flickered with the slightest draft, casting shadows that stretched and danced across the old cedar. She thought of nothing and everything, of the year she almost left Oregon, of the sister she hadn't spoken to since their mother died, of a boy she once loved who drowned in the river and took her softness with him. She thought of how quiet the forest had gone, and how different that quiet felt now that she knew it wasn't empty. She didn't know what came next, but she knew this. She'd done something irreversible, and somehow it didn't feel like a mistake. Far outside, on the other side of the clearing, the trees held their breath. A shape stood at the edge of the dark, tall, still, watching the cabin. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. It just waited. Night in the Wallowa-Whitman didn't fall. It sank. One moment, the last orange light clung to the trees like a promise not to leave. The next, it was gone. Swallowed in shadows so dense even the air felt thicker. The kind of dark that didn't invite light. It resisted it. But Jo had lit both oil lamps again, one near the cot, the other by the stove, casting soft amber pools across the cabin's uneven floor. Outside, the valley exhaled a long, quiet breath. Then came the sound. It started faint. A knock. No, not a knock. A pulse. Wood against wood. Rhythmic, distant, like something across the ridge had struck a hollow trunk, waited, then struck again. There was no wind, yet the sound carried. Clear, intentional. Inside the cabin, the wounded creature's breath caught. Jo turned slowly from the stove. It hadn't moved all evening, not even to eat. But now, its chest rose faster. Shoulders shifted. Eyes fixed on the door, not in panic, in longing. Recognition. Whatever called from the valley wasn't strange to it. It meant something. She didn't speak. She sat down near the window, kept her hand close to the fire poker but didn't touch it. Just listened. 3 knocks, then silence. A pause. Then 5 more, faster, from somewhere farther up the slope, returning the call. Jo stared through the pane. Nothing moved, not a single branch swayed, but she felt it in her spine. This wasn't echo. This was communication. This was language. Behind her, the creature's breathing began to slow again. The tension in its body didn't vanish, but it softened. A kind of temporary peace, like hearing a loved one's voice in the dark. Jo didn't sleep that night. She sat in a crooked chair with her back against the door, one boot on the threshold. Oil lamp burning low. Outside, the forest stayed still, except for the occasional beat of wood against wood, sometimes from the valley, sometimes the slope. No threat, no movement, just that steady, haunting rhythm that spoke of something older than fear. By morning, the world had reset. Mist curled low through the trees, and light bled back into the cabin in muted streaks. The wounded one still hadn't moved from the cot, though Jo noticed the way its eyes tracked her more quickly now. Focused, alert. She warmed broth from a can, poured it into a metal bowl, and placed it at the edge of the room. Then she stepped back, far, arms crossed, waited. It didn't look at her. It looked at the bowl. Stillness. Then, slowly, one arm extended. Elbow bent awkwardly, breath held, as if the motion itself betrayed some instinct to remain invisible. Fingers, long, knuckled, rough-skinned like a tree limb, wrapped around the bowl and pulled it toward the cot. It drank in silence. Jo blinked. That moment, the trust it took to eat what she offered, felt louder than the knocks from the night before. The door creaked open without warning. Jo turned fast, hand to her hip, but stopped halfway. A girl stood in the doorway. 17 maybe, tall and wiry, mud caked on her boots and denim jacket. Her cheeks were red from the morning chill. Her hand held a leather lead, and behind her stood a trembling black calf with white socks. Maddie Crowell. She didn't speak at first, just looked from Joe to the bowl to the shadow on the cot. "What the hell?" Joe stepped forward. "He's hurt." Maddie's eyes didn't blink. "That yours?" "No." The girl nodded once, stiff. "He wandered onto our land, near the fence line." She tilted her head. "So did a bunch of weird tracks. I was following the calf." Joe glanced at the sled marks still faintly visible in the dirt outside. Her chest tightened. Maddie stepped in slowly. She didn't scream, didn't run, just stood there, eyes wide but not empty, like someone trying to see through a fog. "I thought it was a bear, or maybe a moose, but that's not—" Her voice trailed off. She shook her head once, hard. "People have been saying they saw something big. Daryl Sutter set a bait trap last week behind the East Ridge." Joe stiffened. "Said if the Forest Service won't handle it, he will." The girl crouched and scratched the calf's neck. The animal nudged her with its nose. Maddie didn't look up when she spoke next. "I won't say anything." Joe studied her. "Why?" Maddie stood. Her eyes met Joe's, tired and older than they should have been. "Because whatever you're doing here, it looks like it matters." She looked past Joe to the cot. "And because I don't think you're the kind of woman who scares easy, but today you look tired as hell." Joe let the silence stand between them. "I used to think the forest was empty," Maddie said quietly. "But it's not. It's full of secrets. I think we're just bad at listening." She turned to go, but stopped at the door. "If you need anything, gauze, antiseptic, I can sneak some from my uncle's trailer. He won't notice, but I'm not coming in again, not unless you ask." Joe gave the slightest nod. "You're braver than you look," Maddie smirked. "Most girls from Wallowa are." The girl walked back into the trees with the calf trailing behind. That night, Joe closed the shutters early. She didn't light the lamps right away. Let the dark settle in first. Let her eyes adjust. Let the sounds come. And they did. Again from the valley. Low, slow, deliberate knocks. 3. Then silence. Then 6. Faster, from the mountain's edge. She stood near the window, breath shallow. Inside, the creature raised its head. Listened. Then did something she hadn't seen before. It tapped its hand, just once, against the floor. The wood sang a low note. Outside, no response. But then, up on the ridge, a single echo returned. Not fear, not threat, just something waiting, something watching. And just beyond the firewood pile, at the edge of her vision, Joe saw it. 2 shapes, not as large, not as still. Standing upright, framed between trees, maybe 6 feet each. Broad-shouldered, shadowed in mist and branch. They didn't come closer. They didn't turn away. They just stood, the way people do when they're waiting for someone to come out and say goodbye. But no, they won't. Joe stepped back from the window, heart knocking once inside her ribs. She whispered to the creature, not expecting it to understand. "They're looking for you." It didn't answer, but it was already listening. And somewhere out there, deep in the folds of pine and stone, the forest listened too. The knocks hadn't stopped. They had changed. In the 2 nights since Maddie came and left without asking for thanks, Joe had heard the pattern shift. Less call and answer now. More like markers. Timing. Communication moving towards something, not just drifting through it. 3 short taps from the west ridge just after dusk. 5, spaced wide, from the valley floor near midnight. Then none until dawn. And when they returned, it was always with a new rhythm. Never random. Never rushed. Like the woods themselves were mapping breath. Joe began to notice the cabin's place inside it. Not apart from the conversation, but drawn into its edge. The oil lamps flickered at odd times now, even without a draft. Her tools, things she hadn't touched in years, were moved. Not stolen, just adjusted. A spool of twine rolled 2 feet closer to the door. A wooden crate that used to hold old coffee tins, now empty but cleaner than it had been in years. Things touched without intrusion. On the fourth morning, she stepped outside early. Sunlight hadn't broken through yet, but the mist was thinner. She could see her own footprints leading back toward the creek, and someone else's. A single set of boots, worn tread. Size 11, maybe 12. No print pattern on the heel. She knew that kind of boot. Worn by ranchers, trappers, men who like to move through wild places without being noticed. The prints circled the cabin once, stopped near the back wall, then vanished into the woods again. She didn't panic. She noted, stored it, and locked the cabin door behind her for the first time in years. By noon, the woods were louder, birds returning, branches shifting, the wind no longer still. But the quiet she feared hadn't gone. It had only tucked itself beneath the louder things. That's when the deputy arrived. Calvin Briggs didn't knock. He stepped out of his truck slow, boots crunching gravel in a way that made it clear he wanted her to hear him. Joe watched him through the window. She didn't reach for a weapon, just opened the door before he could raise his hand. He tipped his hat once, polite. He was in his 40s. Carried himself like someone who used to wrestle bulls but now handled paperwork and regret. "Got a call," he said. "About an unlicensed trap up near the East Ridge. You see anything?" Joe held his eyes. "Not lately." Calvin looked past her into the cabin. "Just for a second. Long enough to register something was different. Not long enough to admit it." He nodded toward the sled marks. Faint now, mostly blown over, but still there. "You move something big?" he asked, casually. She didn't flinch. "Old stove. Been meaning to haul it for scrap." He didn't believe her, but he didn't push. "You hear about Daryl Sutter?" he said, stepping back toward his truck. "I try not to. He's been nosing around, looking for something to shoot." "That sounds like Daryl. He mentioned you." Joe crossed her arms. "Let him." Calvin paused. There was something kind behind his eyes. Something that didn't match the badge or the cigarette pack folded in his front pocket. He looked down at his boots, then back up. "You ever need to report something off the books?" he said. "You know where to find me." Then he got in his truck and left without saying goodbye. That afternoon, Joe found a fresh scrap of gauze tucked under the front step. Folded, still clean. No note. She didn't need one. Maddie had come back, not to talk, not to ask, just to help. But Joe also noticed something else, a different kind of print just past the step. Not a boot, not even a shoe. A paw, maybe. No, wider than that. 5 impressions like fingers, long and blunt. A heel, too, but flatter. Like something walked on 2 legs but hadn't left a full print. Just a warning. A hello. Or both. That night, she waited longer to light the lamps. She let dusk settle all the way in. She sat near the back wall where the firelight barely reached and ran her fingers along the floorboards, feeling for something she hadn't known to look for before. She found it under the cot. A series of scratches. Deliberate. Not the random claw marks of a wounded animal thrashing in pain. These were linear, repeating. 5 vertical marks, then 1 horizontal. Then again. And again. Not angry, not wild. Patterned. Joe reached for the lantern and tilted it low, letting the warm glow pass over the wood like memory. She'd seen something like this before, years ago, while repairing an old ranger post south of Joseph. She'd found carvings beneath a windowsill, symbols made from burned bone and pressed into the frame. The local men said they were hobo signs, secret messages for those who traveled unseen. "Safe place here. No danger. Keep walking." These marks, they felt older than that, like they weren't meant to be read in words, just felt, a kind of debt recorded. The air shifted. Outside, another knock, closer this time, just one, firm. She stood slowly, heart a steady thrum, crossed to the window, opened it just a crack. The woods stared back, silent. But down the slope, just past the edge of the clearing, something stood. Not the one in her cabin, taller, shoulders like a tree trunk, barely visible except for the way its outline blocked the shimmer of starlight. No movement, just presence. Joe didn't call out, she whispered, almost to herself. I see you. The shape tilted slightly. Not a nod, not quite, but something that acknowledged she was no longer pretending not to know. When she closed the window, the air inside the cabin had changed. Heavier, but not menacing. Sacred, in a way she didn't have a word for. She turned back toward the cot. The creature was asleep again, or resting. Its chest moved in slow, deliberate pulls. The bandages were still clean. Its hands curled near its sides, one of them resting on the floor beside those scratch marks, like a memory it couldn't part with. Before turning in, Joe stepped to the far corner of the room and picked up a piece of firewood. Soft cedar, cut smooth. She took her old hunting knife and carved a single vertical line down the center. Then she placed it on the shelf. Not as a threat, not as decoration, as a message. Outside, in the distance, the wood spoke again. One slow knock, then two closer together, then silence. And in the quiet that followed, Joe remembered something Reverend Ann had once said to her. Years ago, after the funeral of a woman neither of them had truly known. Mercy is heavy. That's how you know it's real. That night, Joe didn't sleep with the fire lit. She let it die down. She let the dark stay. Because sometimes, the dark listens back. The cabin was colder than it should have been. Not the kind of cold that came from a weak fire or an open window, but a hollow cold. A space gone still. Joe felt it the moment her boots touched the floor. The cot was empty. Blanket half folded, bandage wrappers on the floor, oil lamp flicked off. The creature was gone. No blood, no sign of panic or struggle. Just absence. She stood for a long time staring at the space where it had lain. Her hand still held the bowl of water she'd meant to use to clean the wounds again. Steam rose from it, curling into the silence like breath from a mouth that wasn't there. Outside, the woods hadn't spoken yet. Joe stepped onto the porch, instinct moving faster than thought. No time for coffee or logic or remembering her age. She followed the prints, shallow depressions in the earth that hadn't been there last night. Not boot tracks, not hooves. Weight spread wide, toes blunt, spaced too evenly to be limping. She tracked them down the slope, past the cedar grove, then toward the bend in the river where the fog always clung longest. Then she saw them, more than one. 3 sets. One was the creature's. She recognized the depth, the uneven gait from the wound still healing. But the others, larger, cleaner, moving perpendicular to his path like a wall. They didn't walk with him. They intercepted him. Joe crouched by a patch of churned dirt. There was no sign of violence, no blood, no drag marks, just a sudden end to the prints. A stillness, like something had been resolved in silence. She placed her hand against the earth. It was still warm from the sun, but the ground felt too quiet. The birds weren't singing here. Not yet. A twig snapped behind her. She turned, hand already on the small axe strapped to her belt. But it wasn't a threat. It was Maddie. The girl froze mid-step, arms raised slightly, a little breathless from jogging uphill. He's gone? Joe nodded once. Maddie looked past her, eyes scanning the trees. I figured. I came to bring more gauze, but I saw something up near the ridge. Thought I should find you first. Joe rose to her full height, knees creaking. What kind of something? There's a trap, Maddie said. A big one. Like the ones they use for wolves, but with more tension. It's not legal, and it's baited. Joe's face hardened. Where? Halfway between here and the old quarry trail. Joe didn't need a map. She knew exactly where that was. They moved fast. Maddie led the way, cutting through the brush with the focus of someone who'd been raised knowing how to avoid snakes and men with bad tempers. Joe followed, boots sinking into damp moss, eyes scanning for fresh sign. They found the trap not far from a dry creek bed. It was buried under a layer of leaves, but the wire glinted just enough to give it away. Beside it, the carcass of a raccoon was staked to the ground, half decayed. The whole thing stank of metal and rot and arrogance. Maddie knelt and pulled a stick from her pack, prodding the outer ring. "It's not rusted," she said. "Set recently." Joe didn't speak. She looked around. The forest here felt different. Not sacred. Tense. Like someone had tried to turn it into a cage. They dismantled the trap slowly. Maddie held the jaws open with a tension bar, while Joe worked the pin loose, careful not to trigger it. When the trap snapped closed on nothing, the sound was loud enough to send a deer crashing through the trees somewhere to the west. "Someone's hunting," Maddie said. "Not for food." Joe picked up the trap, slung it over her shoulder like a burden she didn't ask for. "Let's go," she said. They were halfway back toward the cabin when the forest shifted again. A sound rippled through the trees. Low, like pressure. Maddie stopped walking. Joe did too. Another sound followed. A rustle, then a grunt. Not animal, not human. It came from the ravine to their right. Joe stepped forward slowly, eyes narrowing. The wind blew, and for a moment, she saw movement through the trees. Not one figure. 3. They were standing at the far edge of a clearing. 2 of them were large, broader than the creature she'd nursed. Their fur was darker, thicker around the shoulders. They stood close, motionless, but not hiding. One of them had something clutched in its hand. A long branch, broken near the tip like it had been used more than once. Between them, the wounded one stood. He wasn't leaning anymore. He stood tall, shoulders drawn back, breathing slow and deep. But his eyes found Joe immediately. They didn't flicker. They held. A recognition. Not of thanks, not even of debt, of memory. The larger one stepped slightly forward. The space around him shifted like gravity. He turned toward the wounded one and then toward Joe. No growl, no challenge. But in the stillness, Joe saw it clear as if it were carved into bark. This was not a reunion. It was a reckoning. Suddenly the air felt tight. Joe heard Maddie's breath catch behind her. Then the second larger figure stepped toward the wounded one. Not quickly, but with intention. A dominant motion. Almost casual. But the moment his hand reached toward the other's shoulder, the energy snapped. The wounded one turned sharply. Not violent, not afraid, but deliberate. A hand came up, not to strike, but to block. Joe stepped forward instinctively. She didn't know why. She didn't think. She just moved. The larger figure paused, glancing over his shoulder, at her. That was the moment Joe understood she was being watched not as an outsider, but as a participant. She laid her hand on the axe at her side, not to draw it, just to show she had it. Maddie whispered, "What are you doing?" Joe didn't answer. She stepped between trees until she was visible at the edge of the clearing. The sun broke through the canopy at a slant, lighting her hair, her face, her hands. The second large creature shifted its weight. Its gaze flicked from her to the wounded one, and for a split second, Joe saw doubt. Not fear, not weakness, just hesitation. The wounded one stepped forward now, breath steady. The tension in his shoulders didn't leave, but he didn't lower his head. He stood eye to eye with the larger ones. Not beneath them. Something passed between them. Not speech, not a sound, just space. And then, slowly, the second creature stepped back, but the dominant one remained still. His chest expanded once with a low growl. Not aggressive, but resonant. Joe could feel it in her ribs. Then his knees bent, just slightly. Not from pain, but from weight, from acknowledgement. And just like that, the standoff ended. The clearing held its breath. The light changed. The moment passed. The dominant one turned first, stepping back into the trees, disappearing like mist. The second followed. Only the wounded one remained. His breath heavy, shoulders relaxed. He looked once more at Joe, then down at the earth, then back again. There was no goodbye, no sign, no gesture. But Joe knew he had chosen his place, and she had chosen hers. The clearing had swallowed the moment whole. Joe had stood still long after the two larger figures disappeared into the woods. The wounded one, he didn't follow them. He didn't turn toward her either. He just stood there, as if he too was caught between worlds, unsure of which one still wanted him. Then, like a slow thought breaking through heavy fog, he began to move. Not toward the cabin, not toward the others, but deeper into the trees. Not fast, not retreating. Just away. Joe let him go, but the unease didn't leave with him. That night, the air was tighter. The clouds hung low and heavy, like the sky itself was watching. Joe didn't light the fire. She sat in the cabin with only a single oil lamp, the flames small and flickering like a pulse. Her fingers wrapped around the hilt of the hatchet without lifting it. She wasn't preparing to fight. She was preparing to choose, if it came to it. The forest outside stayed awake. Something had shifted. She could feel it. Then came the knock. Not the soft, coated kind. Not the rhythm she'd come to understand. This was louder, sharper. Wood on wood. Too close to be mistaken for a call from the ridge. It was nearby. Deliberate. She rose quietly, slipped outside, boots crunching lightly over frost-hardened dirt. She scanned the trees. Nothing, but the stillness was wrong. The air smelled off, damp in a way that didn't belong to this time of year, and she realized the knock hadn't come from a tree. It had come from the shed wall. Someone, human, had been here. The lantern she left above the tools was gone. A faint snap behind her made her turn. Too late. A shadow moved in the brush, human-sized, fast. Joe dropped low, instinct kicking in, pulse climbing. Then came the yell. It wasn't hers. Maddie's voice cracked the woods open. "Joe, Joe!" Joe bolted toward the sound, pushing branches aside, the cold slapping her face as she ran. She found her near the slope, tangled in thick ferns, hands scraped, cheeks flushed with panic. "There's more of them," Maddie gasped. "Not the ones you know. 2, maybe more, down by the second creek bend. They had something with them. A net, maybe? I couldn't see all of it." Joe knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" "No," Maddie panted. "But I think they saw me. I ran." The noise came then. Not loud, but close, leaves shifting, ground disturbed. Joe stood, heart racing, and moved forward, staying low. In the distance, moonlight broke through for just a second. Just enough to see movement. 2 figures, men. Not in uniform. One wore a tan parka with an orange patch across the shoulder. The other had a rifle slung low, not raised, but ready. Between them, something struggled. Not big, not the wounded one. Smaller, a shape that thrashed in silence. Joe exhaled once, shallow. She knew what it was. They had one of the others. Maybe a younger one. Maybe one that had come closer than it should have. And they weren't heading toward town. They were heading north. Deeper into the woods where no one lived and no one would ask questions. She looked back at Maddie. "We need to make a sound," Joe said. "Loud enough to confuse them, break their pattern." Maddie blinked. "Like what?" Joe didn't answer. She dropped her pack and pulled the hatchet from her side. Not to use as a weapon. She scanned the clearing, then spotted it. A fallen log. Hollowed, clean on one side from decay. She stepped toward it and swung the blunt end of the hatchet against the bark. Once. Hard. The sound echoed like a drum. She struck again. 2 beats. Then 3. Fast, loud, cracking through the woods like warning thunder. Maddie caught on. She moved 5 feet to the left and clapped her hands once, then yelled. Not words, just sound. High and wild. The woods lit up with noise. Crows burst from the trees. The underbrush shuddered. Joe struck the log again, creating a new rhythm. A language not of words, but of pressure, intention, defiance. She didn't know who would hear. She didn't know if he would. But she struck again, and somewhere beyond the trees, something stopped. Then, in the silence that followed, Joe heard it. A low growl. Not aggressive, not pain, just presence. Then movement, faster than before. Trees swaying, brush snapping. The men were reacting. She heard one shout, "Go, go!" But it was too late. Out of the darkness, a shape broke the line of trees. Not the wounded one. The bigger one. Shoulders wide, arms swinging low. It didn't roar, it didn't charge. It simply stepped into the space like it had been summoned. And it had. The men froze. One raised his rifle but didn't fire. His hands were trembling. The younger figure, the one tangled in their net, twisted sharply, breaking loose just enough to fall sideways. The large figure moved then, fast, with purpose. It didn't touch them, didn't need to. Its presence alone sent both men stumbling back. Joe didn't move. Neither did Maddie. They didn't need to, because this wasn't their moment. The large figure turned, placed itself between the younger one and the men. It stood tall, breath steady. Another figure arrived, smaller than the large one, but faster. Joe recognized the gait. The wounded one, still marked by his limp. But he didn't falter. He didn't look at Joe. He stood beside the large one, flanking the smaller. A formation, a shield. The men didn't fire. They backed away, slowly, breath caught in their throats. And when they finally disappeared into the woods, dragging nothing but fear, the clearing went still again. The younger one, barely 5 feet tall, clutched the older's arm. Not hiding, not crying, just steadying. Joe exhaled. Maddie reached for her hand without a word. They both knew what they'd seen and what they'd done. Joe stepped forward once out of instinct, just to make sure. The wounded one turned finally, eyes finding her. And in that moment, he did something unexpected. He nodded, not like a man, but like an equal. The others disappeared back into the woods, moving without sound. Only their memory remained, shaped like rhythm, held in the hollow ring of a hatchet against bark, echoing into the silence they left behind. They didn't come down the mountain that night. Not the creatures, not the men. But the story did. By morning it had made its way to town. Not the truth, just the version a man like Darrell Sutter could chew into a roar. Something had attacked. Something tall. Something strong enough to scatter 2 grown men in opposite directions without laying a hand on either. That's how he told it. Around the back table at Clay's diner. By noon, the whispers were baked into the biscuits. A monster. A threat. Something that dragged screams across the timberline. Joe heard about it from the look on Calvan Briggs's face before he said a single word. He didn't come with lights or backup. Just pulled up slow outside the cabin like he always had. Left the engine running and leaned against the truck like a man trying not to carry a gun he didn't want to use. He called out once, "Joe!" She stepped out, arms crossed, sleeves rolled up past the elbow. She hadn't slept. Neither had Maddie. They'd taken turns watching the tree line until dawn carved the mist into strips. Calvin's eyes scanned the porch, then the woods behind her. "You heard?" Joe nodded. He exhaled. "Darrell's pushing hard. Said he saw something unnatural. Claims there's more of 'em. He's getting the town stirred up." "I'm sure he is. They want me to organize a sweep." She said nothing. "Joe," Calvin dropped his voice. "They're not listening, and I think they want a body." Joe's jaw clenched. "They won't find one." He stepped forward. "If you know something." "I know what mercy costs," she cut in. "And I know what happens when men with rifles go looking for answers they don't understand." Calvin didn't flinch, but he didn't push her either. He nodded once and stepped back. "Town hall's meeting tonight, 6 o'clock. They'll want someone to speak." "I'm not a speaker." "Maybe not," he said. "But you've always been a better listener than the rest of them." She didn't answer. When he left, the silence he left behind didn't sit quiet. It built, under her boots, in the dry wind that cut between pines like it was dragging something unspoken behind it. Maddie stood just inside the door, her arms folded tight across her chest. "They're gonna screw this up, aren't they?" Joe looked at her. Maddie's voice cracked a little. "They're gonna bring their guns and ruin everything." Joe didn't lie. She just stepped past her, lit the lamp again, and pulled a clean flannel from the rack. "We'll go into town," she said. They rode in silence. The town hadn't changed. It still had the same hand-painted signs. Same gas station with prices 3 cents higher than the next town over. Same clatter of wind chimes on the porch of the second-hand bookstore. But today, it all felt thinner, brittle. like if someone spoke too loudly, it might all crack. Inside the town hall, chairs scraped linoleum. Boots tapped out restless songs. Darryl stood near the front, arms folded across his chest like he owned the weight of the fear he was selling. They were tall, he said. Broad, not natural. I don't know what we're dealing with, but it ain't human. And if we wait, more'll come. Reverend Ann sat 3 rows back. Her hands were folded, lips tight, eyes sharp. Joe and Maddie stood near the back. No one called on them. No one asked. But when Darryl raised a flyer, a crude sketch of something between man and bear, red ink scrawled across the bottom reading, "Wanted for threat to public safety," Joe moved forward. Not rushed, not theatrical. Just forward. The room went quiet. She didn't take the podium. She stood in front of it. Her voice was low. "I've lived here a long time. Longer than most of you've stayed married." A few chuckles, nervous, but they faded. "I've seen bad winters, fires, bears in the wrong places. I've seen people lie to themselves to keep from feeling helpless." Her eyes found Darryl's. "But what I saw the other night wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a monster." No one spoke. "I saw restraint. I saw power that could have crushed something and didn't. I saw something turn away when it could have stood its ground." She looked around. "How many of you can say the same?" The air held. Then Reverend Ann stood. She didn't walk forward. She didn't raise her voice. She just spoke. "We teach forgiveness in church. We teach grace. But we forget what it looks like when it's not convenient." Maddie stepped up beside Joe, quiet, but present. Her presence said more than her words ever could. Someone else stood, then another, not to speak, just to stand. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a protest. Just people remembering their posture. Darryl's jaw worked once. He folded the flyer and shoved it in his jacket. "We'll regret it," he muttered. "You'll see." But he walked out without another word. Later that night, back at the cabin, the woods were alive. Not loud, just awake. Joe sat on the porch, hat in her lap, the stars cut clean through a windless sky. Maddie joined her with 2 mugs of coffee, bitter and overboiled. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then, somewhere beyond the line of trees, something shifted. A shadow, a shape. Not threatening, not intruding, just watching. Joe didn't stand. She didn't wave. She just whispered. "Not this time." Behind her, on the forest floor, a fresh set of prints stopped exactly at the edge of her porch and turned gently away. The frost held longer than expected that morning. Joe noticed it the moment her boots crunched over the porch steps, the sound sharper than usual, like the ground had sealed something in overnight. The trees were still. The air was thick with breathless pause. No wind, no bird song, no sound of deer shifting in the bramble. Just the hush of a forest waiting. 1 week had passed since the town hall meeting, since men like Darryl Sutter had been given silence instead of applause, since no one fired a shot, even though they'd all brought their weapons, since Joe had said what she hadn't meant to say, but knew she had to. She hadn't seen them since that night. No shadows at the tree line, no knocks, no prints, but she had felt them in the way the woods let her pass without resistance, in the sudden silence that fell whenever she lingered too long near the creek bed, in the instinct to look left when there was nothing there, and the knowing that something had just turned away. Maddie had gone back into town 2 days ago. School, family. The rhythm of life that expected young people to pretend the wild hadn't whispered directly to them. She hadn't spoken much when she left, just handed Joe a folded note. "I know it wasn't a dream. I saw it too." Now, Joe stood outside the cabin with a mug of lukewarm coffee, watching the mist roll low and steady like a blanket being dragged across the forest floor. Then she saw them, 4 of them, stepping from the edge of the trees, spaced in a deliberate line, like a ceremony, not a visit. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Joe didn't move. The one on the left was young, not a child, but still unfinished. Slighter frame, faster steps. Next to him, the one she remembered from that clearing. Massive, broad-backed, shoulders rolling with quiet weight. Not aggressive, simply sovereign. The third was the wounded one, though now he moved without a limp. His chest rose steady. He stood taller than before, not because his body had healed, but because something had shifted inside him. The fourth figure stood apart, not in distance but in gravity, taller than the rest, broader. His presence didn't dominate, it stilled, like an old stone in the riverbed that even water had learned to move around. His fur was darker, laced with faint streaks of gray around the neck and chest. His eyes were deeper set, lined, ancient in a way that didn't mean years, but experience. They came to the edge of the clearing and stopped. None crossed the invisible threshold where earth turned to cabin floor. They stood with discipline, with purpose. Joe stepped down from the porch, barely 5 steps forward. Then the old one moved. He stepped ahead of the others with the solemnity of a mountain shifting. No hurry, no hesitation. In his right hand he held something. Joe didn't see it at first, not until he came just close enough for the morning light to catch it. A knife, but not one made of metal. Obsidian, polished smooth, dark as midnight, with edges that glinted blue where the light touched the stone. The handle was bone, old, worn, etched by time and hand. Its shape wasn't threatening. It was ceremonial, sacred, the way one might pass down a story too large for language. Joe didn't flinch. The old one knelt slowly, pressing one hand to the ground. With reverence, he laid the knife onto the forest floor between them. He didn't look at her when he did it. He looked up at the trees. The moment held. Not like a pause in conversation, but the end of a sentence that never needed words. Joe stepped forward. She didn't touch the knife. Not yet. She knelt, mirroring the gesture, not imitating, matching it. For a long moment, they simply breathed in the same air. The forest didn't stir. Even the wind held its tongue. Then, gently, the old one stood. He stepped back. The others followed. Not retreating, not turning away, just returning. Their silhouettes vanished into the mist like memories that refused to die. Joe stayed kneeling. Her eyes traced the knife. The bone handle had 5 worn notches, human-sized, worn in the same way her father's old fishing knife had grooves from where his fingers always rested. These weren't marks of possession. They were records of use. She reached forward, fingers trembling, not from fear, from the knowledge that once she touched it, something would change. She lifted it. It weighed almost nothing, but it felt heavier than most truths she'd ever held. Back inside the cabin, the fire had died down to embers. She didn't stoke it. She sat near the window, the knife resting in her lap, and let the silence fill her like breath. Later that evening, she cleaned the blade gently, wrapping it in soft cloth and placing it on the highest shelf near the hearth. Not displayed, not hidden, simply honored. She didn't speak to anyone about it. Not Maddie, not Calvin, not even Anne. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't for explaining. The next morning, she opened the cabin door and left it that way for a while. Let the air move in and out. Let the light shift the shadows along the floorboards like water finding its own course. She moved slower these days, not because her body ached more, though it did, but because everything felt worth moving through with care. When she reached for her boots, something beneath the laces caught her fingers. A strand of moss, fresh, still damp with dew. It hadn't been there yesterday. Joe smiled without thinking, not because it was a sign, because it was enough. The forest had given what it needed to give, not a truce, not a promise, but a bond, one not made in words or fire, but in mercy. And mercy, she now understood, wasn't about being soft. It was about standing firm in the place where harm ends. She walked out to the clearing once more. No sign of them. No tracks. No sound. Only trees, shifting gently in the breeze. She stood there a long time, not waiting, just remembering. She never saw them again. But every now and then, on certain mornings when the mist moved just right and the birds chose silence over song, she'd feel it. That hush. That space between heartbeats. And she'd glance toward the tree line and whisper, almost beneath breath, "I'm still here." There are places in this world that don't ask to be understood. Places that exist quietly, far beyond the roads we pave or the names we give. They don't need permission to endure. They just do. And if we listen close enough, really listen, we begin to sense the rhythm of something older than judgment, something deeper than proof. Some things are not meant to be explained, only witnessed. Not all truths come wrapped in facts. Some arrive in silence, in gestures, in the spaces between what we say and what we choose to do. And in those spaces, something sacred lingers. Not sacred in a religious sense, but in a human one. A reverence for life, for mystery, for the soft choice to show mercy when fear is louder. Because sometimes the greatest strength isn't in fighting back, it's in stepping back. Sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is to not turn away, to not shoot, to not demand understanding before offering compassion, to not need control to offer care. We forget that we belong to the natural world, not the other way around. We forget that survival and kindness aren't at odds. In fact, they might be the same thing. Kindness isn't weakness. It's a kind of memory, a muscle passed down from those who chose gentleness, even when they had every reason not to. And maybe that's all that matters in the end. Not how much we know, but how much we are willing to protect what we don't. There's a kind of wisdom that lives in the wild. Not the kind that comes from books or maps or stories told around firelight, but the kind that watches, that waits, that tests whether our actions speak louder than our fears. When we answer with care instead of conquest, with stillness instead of suspicion, the wild answers back. Maybe not in the way we expect, but in a way that changes us if we let it. So if one day the trees seem to lean in a little closer, if the wind feels thick with presence, if the silence doesn't feel empty but full, don't run. Pause and ask yourself what it means to be trusted by something that owes you nothing. Because trust is never earned with force. It's offered in the quiet. And it is always, always watching who will hold it gently. Thank you for being part of this story. One not just about the unknown, but about the unseen strength that lives in all of us. If this journey spoke to you, if it stirred something quiet in your chest, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, what you felt, what you believe is still out there. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to our channel. These stories are just the beginning, and together, we're building a community that believes mystery and mercy can live side by side. Until next time, may you walk gently, listen deeply, and always leave room for wonder.